Hey, what's up? There are some really amazing fantasy movies that came out way in the past. And no matter how much they've tried to do it, they've never been able to replicate them. They've never been able to make them better. Even with the new technology and everything, they've never been able to improve on some of the greatest older fantasy movies of all times. And it's strange because, like, you would think, with the modern technology, you can make better special effects and you can make it look better and whatever, right? But still, there's just so many great fantasy movies that came out back in the day that are just good and haven't been remade, and they can't remake them. And even though they tried to remake them, they've never actually been able to remake them because they are so good. One of the first ones that comes to mind is all of the different animated fantasy movies, like Wizards, like Heavy Metal, like the old The Hobbit, which was like the Hobbit animated fantasy movie and stuff like that. There were so many great ones, and what I like about those is just like they were making these like these really really cool animated movies, and sometimes they would put like puppets in it, like in The Dark Crystal, in Legend, in Labyrinth, right? In The Neverending Story, right? They were able to put a combination of people, and they would put together these puppets. And that's kind of the thing back then where, like, when you did special effects, you had to either make them really, really good, you have to be really careful with them and take a really long time and have like the most expert people in the world work on these special effects and make them amazing. Because if you didn't, it would look like these campy B movies that came out back in the day, which are like also a great genre. And I think that all of these B movies, they call them B movies just because, I mean, they're low budget. They don't have the best actors, they don't have the best directors, but it's somebody getting together and saying, let's make a fantasy movie in the best way that we can. It's such an amateur kind of, it's not actually even amateur. I mean, I've seen amateur like fantasy movies. You could see them all over YouTube, right? You could see like people making little short films or whatever from something that they liked, or like some franchise that they used to like, or some book or something, or some kind of old story, and they just make a fast movie out of it. It's not like a big movie, it's not high production, but they do what they can, and they were very, very inspired to make it. And a lot of the movies that they made back then, they just haven't been able to remake them. They haven't been able to make them amazing again, And even with the special effects, even with the bad special effects, I mean, I'm not going to say that the special effects were bad, because and sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't. But like, for example, Clash of the Titans, right? They had great special effects for the time. It was like cutting edge. It looked really cool. The flying Pegasus, and all the monsters and the Medusa, all of that stuff that they made it look so cool. They made it look so it's dated, but the thing is that like they knew the special effects were just gonna maybe impress people that kind of like, thought that was kind of cool how they did that. It was as realistic as they can get. But what they did was, when you don't have special effects to rely on, you have to rely on story, you have to rely on storytelling, you have to rely on writing. And they did actually have like a few good actors in Clash of the Titans. They had Burgess Meredith was in it, who was a great actor at the time. Even the people that played that played some of the other roles. I think the person that played Perseus was was actually a pretty good actor at the time, and stuff like that. And it's funny because people like were like, oh, yeah, well, fantasy movies, the special effects are campy, but what can you do? Like, that's the best they can do, right? But they still made some great films. Look at something like Flash Gordon, for example, as a science fiction movie that came out back then. And Flash Gordon, they've never made another Flash Gordon, and they should make another Flash Gordon. They made a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, an older one. So I know so many people have not seen the older Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, And I think that's definitely a better one, in my opinion. The new one was good, but the old one, and it wasn't even that new. It was like, oh, that came out over 10 years ago. But the older one was awesome. With bad, like, it was a British film. It was really bad special effects. Horrible, right? But it was just so cool. The special effects were so bad that they were good, and you don't always see that. Because a lot of times, things are just so bad that they're bad. Like, if they're bad, they're bad. But when they're bad, they're good. Like on that movie, it was just because the story was already good. The book was already good. And so they just made the movie out of it. And they didn't have to do much because the book was already great. And they did the other one. They made a more modern one, yeah, whatever. But it was actually a good one. I didn't, thought it was good. But the older one, it's hard to find. And look at something like Tron, right? Where they had like the older Tron, which I think Tron is something that I don't know if you could ever make that into a more modern movie, I don't think you can ever make Tron into a modern movie because like Tron was dated at the time that they made it, right? It was when computers and video games just first came out. And the idea was someone got teleported into a video game, into a computer, and the computer was the master, and the computer was the one, it was the computer's world, right? And they were like in that world, and they had to fight all the different things that the computer threw at them and escape from that world and go back to their own world, That whole idea, they can do that, but they actually had to, it got upgraded. It no longer was Tron, and it became The Matrix, right? It became something like that, which was like they're in a computer simulation, and it went from computers being like this thing you put on your table and play a game on to this thing that you hook up into and basically launch yourself into another world, into another world that it's hard to even tell whether it's real or fake because it's just like computer generated. And then what's interesting in the Matrix is the computer generated world was so much better than the contemporary world, than the world that they were in, because they were in some spaceship, basically some, tin can spaceship, which like bad food, like no nature. They were just inside a spaceship. Basically, that's all that they were. They couldn't ever leave that spaceship, but they could plug into the Matrix and they were anywhere and they could do whatever they can just imagine. And that's the Tron like 2.0. Movies that can't ever be made again. For example, Logan's Run, another science fiction movie where I don't know if they can actually ever make an updated Logan's Run. I think the story still stands. What's interesting about Logan's Run is that like people lived in this modern world where everything was automated. People didn't have to do anything because machines and computers did everything for them. But the thing is that they had like, basically they were in a dome, right? They were in like a finite space and they couldn't have too many people there, right? So they would have to just like get rid of people at an early age, relatively early age, because just to have more people. I think they were cloned or something like that, or born. They weren't born naturally or whatever. It was just part of that whole story, which was just interesting. And they've never made another Logan's Run. They've made a series of Logan's Run, but they've never made another movie Logan's Run. Conan the Barbarian, which is like, it's weird that they've never been able to make a better Conan the Barbarian than the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. I mean, he was good in Conan the Barbarian, but they couldn't make a better one for some reason. And it's such an easy thing to make a movie out of, just because there's a whole lot of Conan stories that just haven't been made into anything. There was like the Frost Giant's daughter and another one, some elephant one or whatever it is, the elephant something, whatever. And they never made Frost Giant's daughter into a movie. They could, they just never did. Instead, they made this new, and it's not even new at this point. It happened it happened like in the early 2000s or something, like over 10 years ago, where they made another Conan and it wasn't as good. I mean, they made the second Conan with Arnold and it wasn't as good. Then they made another one and it wasn't as good. And which is weird because like, is the day of like good B movies that come out really good and surprise everyone because it looked like a B movie until like you watch it and you're like, wait, this was a good movie, I think that was the thing with like what do you call it? Flash Gordon. I remember watching Flash Gordon, seeing, being like, oh, this is like gonna be a bad movie, and even watching it thinking, oh, this is, I like it, but it's still a B movie. And what's interesting is like even up to today, they've never made a better Flash Gordon movie than that older movie that came out, and it was not that bad. Music by Queen, um, some great like fight scenes, the most evil freaking villain ever, one of the most, Ming the Merciless, which is like he was bad. I mean, he was evil. You didn't like that guy, and when Flash Gordon defeats Ming the Merciless and the entire world celebrates his victory, I mean that's just something you feel for, because you hate that villain so much and you want him to go down and you want the good guy to win in that one. And it's weird because even with like there weren't great special effects, but there were good costumes and there was good music and there was good, there was just, maybe it wasn't great acting, but it was good enough acting and it was entertaining. It was like it was impressive. It was good. You felt like they were telling the story and it was believable. Like you were in the story, you were in it with them. They got you hooked on what was happening in the movie. And that's pretty much what actors just have to do. They have to just get you into the movie and make you believe that character's real enough that you feel like, you feel like you're you care about that character. You're behind that character and you don't like the villain and and all that stuff, right? And I mean the animated movies like Heavy Metal is another one where they've made the first Heavy Metal, which was like in the early 80s, which is the animated thing. And I wish they would do that again because they've only done they did another Heavy Metal, which is Heavy Metal 2000, and literally was in 2000. It wasn't as good as the first one, but I think people generally who liked the first Heavy Metal thought the second one was okay. I thought it was okay. I thought it was worth a watch. I thought it was okay. What I think they did right was instead of making little short stories in the Heavy Metal movie, which was like, I felt like that's the thing about the old Heavy Metal movie. Even though I liked the different short stories, I just was like, I would prefer it to be one story instead of like little short stories and you go from one to the next. But just like in the magazine, Heavy Metal magazine is about little short stories, little fantasy and science fiction short stories that they go from, one story to the next to the next. And so they did like Heavy Metal the movie, just like they did Heavy Metal the magazine. But then when they did Heavy Metal 2000, they did like one long story. The only thing is it wasn't that great. And maybe if they would have done short stories, they would have maybe had some hit or misses. Because even in the first Heavy Metal 2000, it was still, some of the stories were hit or miss. They weren't really miss, but I think that like some of the stories hit more than the others. Like Tarna was cool. Like Den of Earth was not bad. There was a funny one with one of those guys that was, the was it was one of those guys that was that guy, whatever it was. He was on trial or whatever. It was weird. He was convicted of like a million different crimes, and was Stern, right? That was his name, Stern. Oh man, and that one was just funny, and it wasn't anything else. There was another one with the spaceship, and they teleported this girl onto the spaceship. She was a secretary girl, and she had the Lochnar on her, like she was wearing it like jewelry, and she didn't know it was the Lochnar, and they like teleported her up into her spaceship and took her on this like to this other planet, which was okay. But I think like when they came out with Tarna, and then when they opened with the guy that was in the taxi, which was cool. They even like that one was so influential. The one where like the first animated feature of Heavy Metal, where the guy was in the taxi driver in the future New York. That was so influential in how they did that they made an entire movie out of that called The Fifth Element. Where that was basically what it was. The guy in The Fifth Element was the live actor. He was in the same thing. He was in a floating taxi, basically. And he met the girl that kind of just fell onto his taxi, and then the two of them went on this adventure. She basically took him on this adventure. you know, who was Leilu in the movie, but in the animated Heavy Metal was like a different girl. And then there was Tarna, and that should be its only movie. I think that Tarna could do like a full-on animated movie because the character is good, and I think that it's been around long enough, and especially like now that they're making stories about Tarna in the comic, they can take that story or take stories or people that like are making up stories about Tarna or whatever. And Tarna is so popular that Heavy Metal can do this like sort of like call of ideas to people, to just fans of Tarna, to fans of wanting to make that into a movie, to say what kind of movie should Tarna be and what should the story be about. And I think just enough people know who she is and want to make a story about it that they would pretty much come up with some good ideas about Tarna and what kind of like story that should be, you know. And that's the thing, you know. So those movies, like Wizards was another one, which was a great movie that came out really like I think in the 80s also. Yeah, it was in the 80s. And it was just another one of these things, and it's just hard. They haven't made a really good animated Western animated movie. I mean, they've made it so many mangas and they made so much anime and stuff. They make some good animated fantasy movies, but they're not that popular, and there's really not that many compared to like, you know, how many animes there are, which is like there's just tons of them. I don't mind the animes. Some of them are good, like, you know, Ghost in the Shell, whatever was pretty good. If it's a good anime, I'll watch it. You know, Akira was a good anime, and that also came out way back in the day. You know, some of those animes are really good, and they're all fantasy. You know, anime is just all fantasy and stuff like, or science fiction usually, right? And some of them are like horror monsters, which is pretty cool also. You know, but no, but that's the thing about it. The thing about the anime is the art style. It just, I don't know. It's just like anime. It's anime. You know, I want to see a Western one. I want to see something that's not Japanese. You know, that I think, you know, for people in Western countries that want to actually see something that's not like stylized in a Japanese way. You know, and that's the thing about it. And like, I mean, they had a few of them, and now they're making some animated features, but they're not making that many, and I don't think they're that great. But I do think that like when back in the day, those B movies, those sword and sorcery B movies, they're worth a watch. Whenever I see any like older like 80s or something like that, sword and sorcery, anything, I will watch it because a lot of the times it's a B movie, but those B movies are so good. They're really good because like they do things in those B movies that they don't do in the A movies. They just it's a story. It's usually it's not done so polished and so professional, and that it looks a little bit more I don't know. It looks a little bit more like they have to rely on other things. You know, like B movies relied on things like nudity, you know. They relied on a lot of other stuff. They relied on, I mean, some kind of like sword fights, for example, or even like the special effects of those B movies, like are they're just so they're old school, but they're cool, and they relied on like costumes, and they relied on a lot of different things. Like if you look at the 80s Dune, for example, it was a great movie, I think. It was considered a failure of a movie, but you know, I don't know, whoever considered the failure of the movie were just people that were like, it's got to make this much money and it's got to be this popular and it's got to be like and critics have to say this about it in order for it to be successful, right? What they're doing is they're saying, okay, it's only a movie if other people, you know, if the experts of what's in, you know, what's a good movie say it is, you know. Well, who's the expert of what's a good movie, right? And it was interesting is that like they just Kyle MacLachlan was told by basically when he was interviewed, he was told who played the main character of the movie, right? he was told by Stephen Lynch basically that was it David Lynch that like this was not a great movie, and they went on to do another movie, and they did Blue Velvet, which was one of the probably the most violent, disturbing movies ever made. Still a great movie, but what's weird is Blue Velvet got all the praise, even though it was a messed up movie, and I think that maybe possibly because they made it so it had elements of let's just put extreme violence in the movie, make it so over the top violent that people won't even take it seriously because it's just unbelievable. And the characters are completely unreal, right? The characters, like the bad guy, the whole group of the villains in Blue Velvet, they're not even realistic. Like nobody's like that. Nobody's like, maybe, I don't know, maybe there are people, unfortunately. Hopefully not. Hopefully nobody's like that because they're just so bad and so evil, you know. But for some reason that one got praised. But like a solid like video, like movie telling of a really good story, like Dune, you know, for some reason. But the thing is, it was high budget and it was definitely not a B movie, and that's the kind of only difference is that like, you know, with A movies, it's like they got the budget, they got the money to make it, they got the special effects, they got all the movie studios doing it, they got Industrial Light and Magic, who used to do special effects, doing it, they got all the costume people doing it, they got all the like set design, they got everything going on, and Dune had that, and Dune had a great story. Dune had one little thing about it, which made it, I think it was the only reason why it was considered a movie that wasn't like, it wasn't considered like a great movie. And I think the only reason for that, the only flaw I saw in it was when I saw it, it didn't, like, I didn't really understand what was happening in it. I saw the different scenes, and I understood the scenes. The scenes were cool, the different situations that the characters were in, and the scenes and who the characters were, and stuff like that. The scenes were cool, but when you put it all together, you're like, what's happening in this movie? And the reason is, what they did was they took a gigantic book, which was even the first book of a gigantic series, and tried to compress that into a movie and make it coherent. They tried to make it something that people could understand, you know, something that people could understand. And like, it wasn't. A lot of people were like, what's happening in this movie? Because they just like explained really none of it. You know, it's just this happened, then that happened, then that happened. I thought that all of the different scenes were cool though. And I thought that like, yes, after you watch the movie a couple of times or a few times, you do understand what's happening in the movie. Because you're like, oh, I see how it goes from one to the next. Same thing with like Heavy Metal, the motion picture. It's like, I didn't know what was happening. I was like, I saw the Heavy Metal movie as like different short films, and I didn't really understand what that Loc-Nar was and the whole concept. But if you watch it a few times, you realize that there's this Loc-Nar is this green glowing entity, which is evil, and everyone wants to possess it because they think that possessing it, they will get great power. But once they possess it, it kills them and just moves on to the next kind of victim who wants the power from it, but it ultimately gets killed by it at the end. And that's what tied Heavy Metal together. And it took me watching it several times to go, oh, that's what the story is. I just saw it as a series of short stories, right? And that's the same thing with Dune. What was interesting was Dune came out with a DVD, also back in the day, that came out in the DVD with a DVD, which was like the extended version of Dune. So it was maybe an extra 40 minutes or so of content in Dune, and I was like, oh, this will make sense. This fixes Dune, because Dune was, the problem was not understanding what was happening. They didn't explain it enough, and they didn't really put the scenes through enough. But with this extended content of the movie, and they didn't delete any of the scenes. They showed all of the scenes. Oh, that would fix it. And what was interesting was watching that, I realized that was way worse than the original movie. It was better to not understand what the movie was happening in the movie than to watch this extended content, because that just made the movie boring. Like, it was like, wow, this is boring, because it was just boring. The fact that they made it fast, it was cool. But look, I mean, the thing about movies is, and you don't understand the movie completely, but you kind of like it anyway. Look at how many songs there are out there which make no sense, and people don't understand them but still like them, right? What about poetry? There's so much poetry out there that people don't understand but they still like. The stuff that, for example, like Jim Morrison wrote for The Doors, a lot of this stuff makes no sense, right? There's so many albums, there's so much music out there where the lyrics just, they're nice and they have a vibe and they have maybe some meaning to it, but they don't make any sense. You know, they just don't make a lot of sense. There's a whole lot of songs out there, even super popular songs, some like total hits, you know, some of the best popular songs of all time, which make like, what is this song about though? You know, and there's so many people like, oh, it's about this or it's about that, and they try to like make up reasons of what it's about, but they're like, I don't know what it's about. Like, is it really, was that what it was intended to be about? There's so many songs by so many bands. In fact, there's so many of them that like, you can't miss those songs. Like every few songs that you hear, even like on every album, a lot of songs are just like, what is it about? Some songs have a meaning and they express that meaning to you. A lot of other songs have lyrics and they're like enigmatic and you're like, well, what is it about? And a lot of times these songs are only like, the only person that knows what they're about is the person that wrote the song. It sounds good and people like it, but they don't really understand it. And so, you know, I think it's okay to have a movie that is more poetic and maybe not everyone understands it the first time, you know, but that's the only way you're going to see Dune unless they make a series that's really good. And I don't know, because like making the longer version of Dune seems to not work as well, because explaining every little thing that's in the book might work for the book because people are like sitting down and reading a book, might not work for something like a series because it's just not enough action in it to actually, it explains everything, but it's not that move from one scene to the next that you want from a movie, you know? So there's kind of that. I mean, also they haven't been making a lot of these like puppet movies anymore. You know, the movies with like, sort of like maybe some live action, but also like puppets. You know, the ones in Labyrinth, the ones in Legend, Neverending Story, The Dark Crystal. They have actually made another Dark Crystal, which I think I saw some of it, but for some reason, I mean, I like the Dark Crystal's characters and whatever, but I don't necessarily think the story itself is that great. I think the puppets are cool, and I like how they look, but in the old Dark Crystal, I really don't really see that they're like that great. But I think that like, even with like if you look something like there's like a movie that they could never make into a, even with better special effects they can't make it into the movie, like RoboCop, for example. I mean, there's a lot of other movies, like they even made Total Recall, right? They made it into another movie. It was like another Total Recall. It was packaged as a remake of the original Total Recall, but they did something interesting in the second Total Recall, which they completely changed the plot, they completely changed the story. There's some of it which is the same, which is the idea, which is like, he goes into this Total Recall, and then when he comes out, he doesn't know what the hell's happening, and this whole story like takes him on this journey, and you know, this thing that afterwards, but there was that, but they weren't able to make a good movie. I didn't think, now I know some people thought that the second Blade Runner was good, but I didn't think the second Blade Runner was definitely as good as the first one, because I think it was just like that, it was another story in that universe rather than being a continuation of the first Blade Runner. I think that's another one where even with better special effects, they weren't able to improve it. And I think a lot of the reasons is we had these great actors back then that made these movies, and now they're just too old to be in those movies again. You know, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, like he can make a Conan movie if they allow them, you know, because I think that they're just not allowed to do it because they can't touch the Conan franchise at this point. Somebody owns it, they don't want to give it away. They're not making any movies, they don't want anyone else to make any movies, you know, and stuff like that, you know, and so some of the Conan movies, like, you can make a Conan with Schwarzenegger, which is, I think, what everybody wants to do that. He's not going to do another Terminator, right? He's not going to do another, like, Predator. So That's the thing. I don't know if they're going to do another Aliens. That would actually be cool. And that's another one. I haven't actually followed the Aliens franchise, but I think the video games are actually pretty cool. Alien versus Predator was a great video game. You got to play as the Alien, Predator, and Colonial Marines. Three different games in one. They weren't long games, they were shorter games, but they were three in one. So you could play it as all different characters. It was awesome. That's definitely a good recommendation and stuff like that. But that's another thing. They made Predator and they haven't made a real. I don't think they've made like an updated Predator and stuff like that. Just there was just so much stuff back in the day that they made. Even something like Battlestar Galactica was they changed it into something completely different. Like that series, I watched some of the series. I didn't like it as much enough to actually watch too much of it. I watched like a little bit of it, and it just doesn't seem really, you know, I don't know. It doesn't seem really like what is it? Authentic. Like it doesn't seem like original. It feels like clones, robotic, weird clones against humans again. You know, it's like that's the thing about science fiction recently, where like they haven't made any good new ideas in science fiction. And hey, what about another like Blade Runner? Or well, they could make another Blade Runner. They could make another like story in that universe. They could make a good Terminator. That would be cool. A good Matrix. They could be making, you know, something from what was happened back then. Like they made Hulk. You know, there was the Hulk and there was stuff like that, right? But that's the thing. They had an old sci-fi series called Space 1999. They had Blake 7. They had so much stuff back then, and it was so good at the time. So I don't know if it'd still be good now. If you watch it now, you'd still like it. But definitely, I think that they just haven't really made too much. You know, they took these franchises and they just left them alone. They were successful, they were good, and for some reason, you know, just because you make a sequel or another story in that world and it's not that great, it doesn't mean you should stop making. Stop. It doesn't mean you should stop getting ideas from that. Like you don't have to make something called Conan the Barbarian. You could just make it and call it whatever, but it could be inspired by Conan the Barbarian. Look what they did with Red Sonja. Red Sonja. Look what they did with Red Sonja. Look what they did with Xena Warrior Princess, right? I mean, she's sword and sorcery. She's inspired by 80s sword and sorcery. And I really do recommend, I think that like any 80s sword and sorcery, like whatever, if you get a chance to see any 80s sword and sorcery, see it, because most often than not, they're really good. Because back in the day, you know, those sword and sorcery movies, they were either really good or they were still good. They were just like, most of them were good. The only one I didn't really like was Sword and Sorcerer, but there was so many great ones like Dragon Slayer, and it was just so many great ones. They would just make so many of them, and despite the fact that they didn't have great special effects and having good special effects was expensive, you know, they would still go ahead, get whatever budget they could. They couldn't hire the best, you know, director. They couldn't hire the best writers, musicians, and actors and all that stuff, you know. They couldn't have like the best scenes and sets and whatever because they didn't have the budget for it. And I think back in the day, that was just like, they did what they could with what they had, right? They didn't have the gigantic budget, but they made a lot of great stuff. It's so interesting because the story's good. And even the special effects that they did have were cool to watch. Like even if it wasn't like that impressive, it was still at the time. Sometimes it was convincing enough. Those special effects. A He-Man movie. They made a He-Man movie, but they've never made another one, and that's weird because they made more He-Man cartoons, right? They made another like a retelling of He-Man cartoons, but no movies. And there's just so much great stuff back then, and they should definitely like either like bring it back some way or maybe even remake it and just keep it true to the story. So these are just some of the old movies, fantasy movies and ideas that I kind of have from like watching the older fantasy movies compared with the newer ones. So let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments, and thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a like and a subscribe, and I will see you guys in another video. Later, and take care.